everybody. Welcome to the 2021 International eConference on Religious Trauma. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, one of the great things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Now, something significant to note is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the world's very first and most comprehensive psychiatric research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. And GCRR has actually built a team of approximately 30 psychiatrists, therapists, sociologists, university professors, religion scholars, and PhD candidates from all over the world, all who specialize in the field of trauma research. Now, if you are a specialist and would like to join this international team, just reach out to GCRR through our website and we can give you more information there. But we do have to address one big problem, and that is in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is accepted as a real condition. Unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma remains in its infancy, especially when compared to other studies in mental health. And sadly, this means that there really are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we've all experienced in the tens of thousands, which is that religious trauma exists and that it is a chronic problem within many religions. And as it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical to actually prove it exists. So GCRR is intending to correct this gap of knowledge, and we would like to get your help with this. So we just recently set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first comprehensive empirical study on religious trauma. We want to conduct a massive sociological study on those traumatized by religion in the hopes of providing the foundational data necessary to educate and hopefully prevent religious trauma from occurring in the future. And you may be asking, why are we crowdsourcing this on GoFundMe? The sad fact is that all federal funding for mental health research has come to a screeching halt. And so we have to turn to the public for help right now. So rest assured, any and all donations that you give to this would go exclusively just to funding this study, and any amount that you could give would be extremely helpful. All you have to do is go to gofundme.com and then look for the religious trauma sociological study. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms so we can get the word out about this very important research project. And with that said, I would like to introduce my very good friend and our next presenter. So Gill Harvey today is going to be presenting on developmental religious trauma in the familial setting, imagination or experience. Now, Gill is from the United Kingdom and works as a therapeutic counselor and psychotherapist. She's also a supervisor, researcher, and trainer. She was raised in a small, high-demand fundamentalist religious group following her mother's conversion when she was just 3 years old. Now, having obtained her graduate degree in 2017, she became a doctoral candidate at the Metanoia Institute, Middlesex University, where she has carried out qualitative research and is currently writing up her findings in her dissertation, which is titled Both Sides of the Coin, a narrative exploration of the influence of a fundamentalist religious upbringing on mental health and well-being in adulthood. She is particularly interested in early developmental religious experiences and mental health and well-being in adulthood, as well as the relationship between psychotherapy and spirituality. And she will, of course, be contributing to the GCRR's major religious trauma research project. And we're so happy to have her. Gill, thank you so much for being here. I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Darren. Welcome to everyone this afternoon. I am very pleased and very excited to be here. Just sharing my screen so you can hopefully see my PowerPoint slides as we go along. So I'm going to speak this afternoon on my doctoral research and I'm just in the final stages of writing up my thesis. And the talk this afternoon, as Darren has pointed out, is developmental religious trauma in the familial setting, imagination or experience. And I thought that was quite a neat title, and it very clearly pinpoints that the focus of my research is on the family settings. There's quite a lot of research around things that happen maybe within churches or mosques or synagogues, for example. But from my own experience as an insider researcher, I was very interested in particularly looking at the family environments and children growing up within those environments and the impact on mental health and well-being in adulthood. The title of my research project is Both Sides of the Coin, a narrative exploration of the influence of a fundamentalist religious upbringing on mental health and well-being. And I've coined the term, no pun intended, both sides of the coin, because in my research, I've looked at both the benefits and the challenges and sometimes abusive experiences that children and young people can have growing up in such environments. The more astute of you there will notice that the coin, the farthing, as it was way back when in the United Kingdom, is dated 1954, the year of my birth. So the research questions that I sought to address: might a fundamentalist religious upbringing be an influential factor on mental health and well-being in adulthood? What are counsellors' experiences? So my research, I've used unstructured interviews, and I've spoken to a number of counsellors. I'll say more about that in a moment, about their own experiences and anonymised stories from their clients. Although interestingly, most of the focus has been on counsellors' own experiences. The aims and objectives of my research project have been to enable co-researchers to tell their own and their clients' stories on the topic, and to psychoeducate professionals to recognise and understand the influence of a fundamentalist religious upbringing on mental health and well-being in adulthood. What became clear to me was that many of us who have had such upbringings have never been able to tell our story to someone who understood, and that has included professionals. And then to add to the sparse literature on this largely hidden topic. Obviously, there were some key ethical considerations that needed to take place. Qualitative research is emotional in nature, according to one viewpoint, but can also be a spiritual experience. Another perspective is that religion, spirituality, and mental health is a tough topic to research. And of course, my research covers all of those elements. Therefore, it was really important that in order to get ethical permission, stakeholder analysis and assessments were drawn up, both for primary and secondary stakeholders, and that included myself as an insider researcher. And then eventually ethical permission was granted by both the Metanoia Institute and Middlesex University. I'm going to speak very, very briefly about the design methodology, just to give you some context before we move on to some elements of the stories that my co-researchers shared with me. So the design methodology, this is a small scale qualitative narrative inquiry. So it was about storytelling, which combined relational centered reflexivity and the collaborative narrative approach. So very much the first two elements reflected the way I work as a therapist And although research can never be therapy and should never be therapy, there can be therapeutic elements to it, as I discovered. And what was quite unusual about this study was that the collaborative narrative approach encourages this collaboration throughout the project, so much so that I was able to share with my co-researchers elements of my own story, which I feel really facilitated the storytelling of the co-researchers. Incidentally, they're called co-researchers rather than participants in my study, because I really wanted to focus on the collaboration, and we were co-researchers throughout what was a very involved process of the collaborative narrative approach. The priority throughout has been to gather and represent co-researchers' unique stories, as I've said, through unstructured interviews. And the choice of the methodology that has emphasized meaning rather than verbal communication in itself has been really important. And what has also been really important is that I've been interested in hearing stories and not necessarily extracting themes and codes and data as would be appropriate for a more quantitative research project. Relational centered, as I've said, reflexive, collaborative approach. So this has been qualitative research across the Abrahamic faiths, so namely Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And while there has been, without doubt, the majority of participants, co-researchers, were from a Christian upbringing, Christianity in terms of tradition, there's also been representations from Judaism and Islam as well. As I said earlier, it was a small-scale qualitative research, 8 initial interviews, although one participant later withdrew when she understood the complexity of what I was asking from my co-researchers and the time that was required. So none of her material has been used in the write-up of my project at all, in agreement with that particular person. So firstly, it's probably quite important to define religious fundamentalism, because it's a very emotive phrase, religious fundamentalism. Interestingly, when I first started to advertise for potential co-researchers, there was some quite emotive debate around the discussion about what religious fundamentalism means. I quite like this definition of it. The belief that there is one set of religious teachings that clearly contains the fundamental, basic, intrinsic, essential, inherent truth about humanity and the deity. That this essential truth is fundamentally opposed by forces of evil which must be vigorously fought. That this truth must be followed today according to the fundamental, unchangeable practices of the past, and that those who believe and follow those fundamental teachings have a special relationship with the deity. My apologies for the length of that definition, but I hope that gives you a flavour of what I'm referring to in terms of religious fundamentalism. So some examples in the literature of what is known as high-cost fundamentalist and or strict religious groups. They're sometimes called cults. So firstly, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often known as the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Islamic fundamentalists, evangelicals, Pentecostals, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, so often known as the Haredi Jews, and some new religious movements according to these writers. That just gives you a little flavour. Let me introduce you to my co-researchers. And of course, I am using pseudonyms here. So, as I said, there were 8 co-researchers originally recruited, and I'm just going to briefly give you a quick introduction to their profiles. So co-researcher 1, Holly, grew up within Evangelical Baptist. That was a self-identified religious upbringing. All of my co-researchers, by the way, grew up in the United Kingdom. My second one, Francesca Alexandra, again grew up in Christianity and in Pentecostalism. On the other hand, Hannah, for the more astute of you, will have noticed that I've got there as a self-identified religious upbringing, liberal Judaism. And it was very interesting that she volunteered to participate. And she's probably one of the co-researchers who spoke mostly about the ability to think for herself, for example, in the liberal Judaism in which she grew up. But she also spoke of her work as a psychotherapist with Jews across the continuum, to the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews as well. Olivia is the co-researcher who withdrew just before analysis stage, and again she grew up within Christian Pentecostalism. My 5th co-researcher, Eva, grew up within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Anna also within Evangelical Baptist, as was Rupert, the only male co-researcher that I was able to recruit. And then finally, Maya grew up within a Sunni Muslim family. So that just gives you an idea of the spread. Janet Heimlich, who some of you will be familiar with her work, she wrote a very insightful book. She's a journalist who's written quite widely on this area. And she said in her book, Breaking the Will, a religious upbringing can be a wonderful experience for a child. Religion can offer comfort to children in distress or crisis. So I guess that is referring to one side of the coin. And some of the benefits that emerged from my own research was about gaining knowledge about religious matters from a young age, and therefore having a foundational beliefs and values. And although the co-researchers not necessarily identify as religious these days, there were some of those foundational beliefs and values that were still in place. And also a sense of belonging in a religious community. So for example, Eva, who grew up within the Jehovah's Witnesses, said, "So we did grow up together, all of us, and have quite good times. My mum would do the children's parties, and there were some very good times because we were all part of a community. Very much a sense of belonging for a period of time when we were infant children. We were all together. Yes, those were probably quite good times." So, in terms of the context of some fundamentalist families, fundamentalist religious families, the relationship between children and parents is not seen as a relationship between equal individuals often, but one where parents are considered to know best and have a certain authority. And what became clear is that in some fundamentalist religions across the Abrahamic faith, there's a hierarchy of God, then father, then mother, and then children. And I'm at the moment, as a therapist, I'm working with a couple of clients who have grown up in a religious cult, and children were absolutely the bottom of the pile. Women were treated badly as well, but children were particularly badly treated. And in terms of power and control, which I spoke at the Atheism Conference, GCRR Atheism Conference in September 2020, I talked about the power and control that not uncommonly exists. So one of the things that did emerge was a them and us culture, and that was certainly my own experience growing up. Francesca Alexandra shared with me, so we're the only ones that are saved, and it would be as far-reaching as different denominations of Christianity. So I remember the Church of England being frowned upon. They're not proper Christians, but we were called to be peculiar people, referring to a verse in the Bible that talks about being called to be peculiar people. And then there was a disadvantage too in terms of feeling different to peers maybe growing up. And I can only give you a brief précis of the stories that were shared with me today. Anna said being constantly scared was unhelpful to fitting in at school, and I felt on the outside looking in, although I wanted to belong. And there was one very moving moment in our conversations where she broke down in tears and said very movingly, I wish you had been my friend growing up, because of course I understood some of what she was talking about. And then another disadvantage, imposed behaviour based on all or nothing rules. So co-researcher Maya, who grew up within a Sunni Muslim family, said, I was often vocal and often standing up for myself and others, saying, no, I'm not doing this. No, I'm not going to wear a scarf. No, I'm not going to the mosque. No, it's not okay to treat others like that. And I was always met with a lot of extreme violence and backlash for that. And that was very moving as she shared about the violence she experienced growing up. Alongside, many of my co-researchers talked about an expectation of absolute obedience, which was sometimes punished if that wasn't present. We were not allowed to listen to non-Christian music, watch television, or read books that were seen as worldly. No makeup. We weren't allowed to go to the cinema or wear trousers, with credit cards and alcohol being strongly disapproved of. Some school activities were regarded as sinful and therefore not allowed. So the end of term discos were banned. That was Francesca Alexandra's experience. And similarly, Eva said, you know, we